Bob, you were born in 1952, and when you were 14 in 1966, you took out your first ad in the Rocket Blast Comic Collector, issue 42.
47.
47.
October 1966.
1966, okay. And then soon after that, when you were 15, you started your first booth at Houston Con selling comics. So tell us about what got you into the Rocket Blast Comic Collector and that first convention.
Well, there was several things happening. In February of '66, I saw a newspaper article, which I was looking for before I came down here, which we can flash onto the YouTube thingamajiggy. From Leonard Brown and Malcolm Willits. It ran all over the USA. They just got this trunk. Had Superman 1-up, Batman 1-up, and you know, they were being said, these things are worth $100 a piece. And then in April of 1966, the first of the classified ads in Marvel Comics started running for comic book dealers sending off. G.B. Love ran the second ad. Argosy Books did a price guide thing, was the first ad. That was April of '66. Probably a couple months later, Gordon Love starts running ads for, he sent $1 off to Miami, Florida for the Illustrated Comic Collector's Handbook #2,
wow,
and a advertising magazine with hundreds of ads in and stuff like this. So right around the same time, Bud Plant, he responded to the same ad, probably the same week. We got the same first issue. He didn't start running ads until much later than me. I placed my ad with this on my, when I got my second issue in, and I typed up a 10-line ad. There were it was 10 lines on a mimeograph for $1. And Gordon Love would retype the ads into these mimeograph things. Mark Scooley and Roy Benario had run a 3.5-page ad. I just happened to be on the bottom half of their 4th page of their ad. And on the front of it, it said, Houston Con is coming, watch for it. And so that was October '66. In May of '67, my brother Gary had died of leukemia when he was 12 years old. And about 3 weeks later, I just had announced to my parents, I need to get out of town. I'm getting on a Greyhound bus. I'm going to Houston, Texas, to something called a Comic-Con.
Wow.
I had no idea what it was. I bought a bus ticket, 28 hours nonstop. Went Omaha, then down to Kansas City, changed buses, went over to Oklahoma City, changed buses, and it was a straight shot down. It was like 120 people there from all over the country. Russ Cochran was there. Ed April had come down from, he was a famous early comics dealer and reprinter of, he was reprinting Buck Rogers. Reprinted Johnny Comet by Frank Frazetta the first time.
Right.
But he was killed in a car crash in the winter of '72.
I see. Now, I want to talk about Fanzation. It was a fanzine you co-published in 1969 to 1970, and it said that Ditko wrote something in one of those that Wertham quoted in his, Frederick Wertham quoted in his fanzine book. Is that correct?
His last book was The World of Fanzines. How that came about, I bought Spider-Man 1 off the rack and really got into it, and was, but I wasn't never just buying superheroes. I mean, I was buying Uncle Scrooge, but Carl Barks. I mean, it's like Magnus Robot Fighter, Turok, Son of Stone. I mean, just buying it all. I never followed one company.
Right.
Never followed the characters. I followed who was drawing it. So I followed Ditko. I followed Wally.
Followed the creator,
I followed the creators. So anyways, how we ended up getting that letter that ended up being printed. Ditko had left Spider-Man, and he was doing some of the Charlton stuff. And in 1968, the Creeper and Hawk and Dove were cranking up.
Right. Okay, I see.
And that's when I took the plunge and started buying 200 of all these #1s that were coming out in 1968.
Oh wow!
Writing off the Batman TV show glut.
Yes.
Where all these publishers were publishing
superheroes.
It was the second largest glut in history after the one in 1952-53 when like 4 billion comic books were printed up back then. So it had to be over 1 billion comics in 1967-68 were printed up, flooding into the 900 ID distributors across the country. They were pushing it all back because it was just 12 cents. But buying 200 of each of those and reading this thing and liking it, the Hawk and Dove and Creeper. At some point here, Gil Kane takes over with a Hawk and Dove number 4. And Ditko's not doing that anymore.
Right.
And then with Creeper number 6, Gil Kane's doing the cover. And we got worried, me and Steve Johnson. So some Saturday morning, we just went through directory phone information in Brooklyn, New York, and got his name out of the phone book, and we called him up. And he had his house upstairs, downstairs phones, so we were each on the phone, and first thing out of my mouth was, "We've been boycotting Spider-Man since you left. When are you coming back?"
Right.
And we're worried. How come Creeper and Hawk and Dove and stuff like? He laughed. It disarmed Ditko on the phone, and he said he'd been promised royalties from the publisher. Is how he put it. And
from Goodman.
We didn't know who Martin Goodman was.
We didn't. Okay.
The world was Stan Lee. Stan Lee this, Stan Lee that. Stan Lee's a really good P.T. Barnum promoter, and that's okay. All industries need that type of person also. Phil Soling was a good promoter. He was a good teacher.
Yes.
That's a better way of putting it.
There you go.
A teacher of. So anyway, so he told us all this stuff, and we were typing this down to put it into Fanzation number 2. And then a couple of weeks afterwards, we told him we were going to do this because we talked a little bit about he'd been promised royalties, and that's why he moved on to get a better deal out of other comic book companies. And a couple weeks after that, we got a letter from him stating that please don't run that thing and stuff like that. So we had a little editorial in Fanzation number 2 saying we were going to be running a bombshell announcement from a big famous comic book artist, not naming him. So in number 3, he sent us another letter. It's all about creativity and how to be creative making comics.
I see.
Which Wortham, around the time Fanzation number 2 and 3, he had a subscription to RBCC.
Yeah.
So I was getting home from high school, and the phone rang, and as I'm coming in the house, and my mom goes, "Bob, there's a Dr. Wortham on the phone, wants to talk to you." And I thought, okay.
That's kind of cool.
One of my comic book friends is just calling up, making a joke. So I get on the phone, I go, "Hey, who is this?" And it was this really thick German accent going, "This is Dr. Frederick Wortham. I'd like to purchase a subscription to your fanzine, Fanzation.
Yeah.
Are you going to keep publishing it?" I go, "Well, yeah. Well, I'd like to buy a subscription, and I will mail you. It's $1 for 3 issues. He mails in $1, so he gets number 3, 4, and 5.
Nice.
So years later, and then I had we exchanged some letters back and forth. He wrote in the reviews of the issues. I wrote him back, so we were going back and forth. Once I realized on the phone that this really is Dr. Wortham, and my first reaction, thinking to myself, was, "Oh no, he's coming for his comic book collectors now."
Yeah.
Because of all the BS of this Wortham being this big evil character destroying the comic book industry, which is not really true. It's more like the Catholic Church came down on Jewish-owned businesses. When you really examine the evidence, Wortham ran a clinic in Harlem, in New York.
A psychiatry clinic.
And he did a lot of pro bono stuff for a lot of lower economic kids. But see, the trip was 95% of all kids were reading comics.
Right.
So you can't extrapolate the data. And then Carol Tilly did a bunch of studies examining his papers, and then these supposed case studies that were in Seduction of the Innocent. He fabricated all that stuff. It was all made up, and none of these people existed. But anyways, years later, in 1974, his last book's coming out from the University of Indiana, I think it was. And I'm reading through it, and Fanzation's referenced like 9 times in there. You can't go by the index. It's only mentioned twice, and one of those pages is wrong.
Right.
So the index in World of Fanzines he exonerates comic books. He was wrong. He just admits in there he was wrong, that we all grew up okay.
Yeah, ended up fine.
And
so do you feel like people are too harsh on him now?
Yeah, I do. stupidly so. I mean, inanely so. I mean, it's like
Yeah, I feel the same way.
his book came out. I mean, you know, in the late 50s, they started attacking rock and roll. Like even Elvis Presley was the antichrist of the world. But Buddy Holly and et cetera.
A climate of the time. So you feel like people unfairly make Wortham the face of this thing? After
that don't even know what they're talking about because somebody else mentioned Wortham.
Yeah.
You know, and so they run with it. And it makes it easier to sell the comics to dealers. So, well, this one's Seduction and Innocence. And somebody went through and tracked down all the comic books ever mentioned in SOTI.
Yeah.
They're called SOTI books.
I see.
And
so it becomes a selling point.
Yeah, they jack the price up on those issues.
All right, that's fair.
What they do.
Right.
But what the main thing that happened with the U.S. Senate is part of their organized crime, Kefauver and crew, part of their organized crime look and anti-Americanism conversations. 1954 is also the year that U.S. Congress, Senate, inserted the words "under God" into our Pledge of Allegiance.
Right.
Just as another, you got to look at back. They were selling fear and hate. What happened? Gaines, Kefauver holds up. I think it was Crime Suspense Stories 22. It's the one where the Johnny Craig cover where the head's chopped off.
Yeah. Right.
Of his wife's. Chopped out his wife's head.
Yeah, he held it.
He's holding the head.
He held it up to
and the guy holds
Gaines,
up the comic book. He goes, "Don't you think this is a little extreme, Mr. Gaines?"
Yeah, he has. Do you think it's in good taste or something like that, right?
Whatever
Something like that.
Whatever the exact words
right.
were. You're probably correct. And Gaines, who was overweight, and back then, diet pills. You know, there was very little pharmaceutical regulations. Diet pills were made out of pure methamphetamine. So he was taking his diet pills, but he'd run out. So he was crashing on national live TV, and he makes a flip remark back that something to the effect about the original artwork to that cover. They had chopped off the bottom inch or two of the cover to publish it, which showed the entrails coming off of and the blood dripping out of the head.
Right.
They thought that was too extreme. And that's where, all of a sudden, Harry Donenfeld, who secretly owned Leader News, that also Simon and Kirby were self-publishing mainline comics. Andrew and Exposito were self-publishing Micros comics. And there was a couple other firms in this Leader News. Harry Donenfeld secretly owned it, which I discovered in 1961. He maneuvered these self-publishers and Gaines because his father, Max Gaines, had been pushing for partial ownership of Superman back in 1939. That's how All American Comics got cranked up. And Donenfeld was the original owner, but then Donenfeld gave his half of it to Jack Leibowitz with orders to, go fuck with Gaines. Just harassing.
I see.
To the point where in 1945, it was either one buy out the other one, and so they bought out Gaines, and Gaines started entertaining comics, publishing, Bible stories and stuff like this, and educational, picture stories of world science, all kinds of other ones, and then animal fables and stuff like this.
Is 1972, 1973 two big years for you as far as over the course of your life significant? 1972, the creation of Comics and Comics, and then also 1973, the Berkeley Convention and a celebration of underground comics. Take us through that, Bob.
Well, in the summertime of '72, that was the first year that convention promoters organized themselves where there was an actual circuit. In '70, '71, you had to drive all the way across country, then you might have to drive all the way somewhere else. This way we followed a circuit that started in Oklahoma City, it was then into Chicago, then into Detroit, we ended up going to SulingCon, and then it was somewhere else. 72 would have been Dallas, and then ended up out in San Diego. So Bud and I, because we're like, ended up caravanning, and other dealer young guys and stuff in their cars with comics and stuff, were falling in and out, and what we were doing was splitting the cost of a Motel 6, which actually was $6. That's why it was called Motel 6. So we get out to San Diego Comic Con. I get out there. Richard Alf was and and Ken Kruger. They were the two guys running the thing. Sheldorf was in the background and stuff, not background, but he was also part of the committees and stuff like that. He was more in tune with acquiring guests coming into the show. Really good at it. But later on, David Siegel took on that position of tracking down MIA Golden Age artists. Phenomenal work that David did.
Right.
But anyways, 72 show, I show up there. But after the show was over, Bud talked me into like going up to San Jose, hang out for about a week and a half or so, and then come back down to LA for the World Science Fiction Convention. Mail order business out of John's house had all been moved out of Bud's house, and him and Phil Seuling were just beginning to purchase fanzine runs together. Mm-hmm. And they take over the whole print run, and then Phil had the East Coast, Bud had the West Coast, basically.
Right.
And then, because it was expensive getting stuff across country. Nothing was on airplanes, it was all trucked or rail, so getting across the Rocky Mountains was really difficult.
Yes.
John wanted to buy in to this mail order business because they'd had done Comic World together in '69 for a short while.
Okay.
And an even shorter while they were partners with Jim Buser and Dick Swan and a guy named Frank Skiddian and Tom Tallman, Mike Nolan in Seven Sons Comic Shop, which lasted like 4 months. And it was basically an oversized closet. Gary Arlington opened up the first comic book store in the back end of an audio-visual place on 23rd Street near Mission. Huh. And business was so incredibly good, that's when Gary Arlington brought out his ECs he was speculating upon, 50 to 100 of each, bought off the newsstands, back in the early 50s. Business was so good and so many people coming to buy comic books, the audio-visual, 8-track tape players being installed in cars. He was like, Gary, you got to stop doing this. It's like, this is cluttering up, the real business. So Gary moves across the street in April of '68, starts negotiating for a lease in March of '68, and opens up the San Francisco Comic Book Company. Right around the time, the same energies coming up from Charles Plymell and Don Donahue are hand printing up the first Zap #1. That was in February '68.
Right.
In March of '68, the Don Donahue edition of Zap #1, and that's when Mo Moskowitz was buying up the print run. He prepays for the print, the Don Donahue 5,000 copy second edition, and then that hand-fed press that they were using, putting in one sheet of paper at a time, then hand-collating. He couldn't make enough fast enough, so Mo Moskowitz pumps in $20,000, gets his friends at the Print Mint, and they print up 20,000 each of Zap 1 and Zap 0 reprints, having to add more paper, 4 pages each, because it was done on a web press.
Yeah.
So, and then a brand new #2, which had an initial print run of 20,000. So that's 60,000 comics being done in a week there.
Wow. Okay.
Mo prepays all of this. Don Schenker had started up also Yellow Dog as a tabloid, like Gothic Blimpworks, like East Village Other, like Berkeley Barb, that kind of same size. A tabloid monthly. Yellow Dog ran like 12 issues, and then I converted. Number 13 converts over into a comic book size at 50 cents. But anyways, so he's more involved with dealing with all the artists and stuff like this. His wife Alice is running the Print Mint stores that they had on Telegraph and in the Haight-Ashbury, subletting pieces out from Mo. Because Mo and Don Donahue had been, back in the 50s, they'd shared an apartment in Greenwich Village in the Beatnik era.
Yeah.
Which a lot of people don't know that. And Peggy was the accountant, comptroller, keeping track of all the money flows and stuff like this. And Bob Rita, an American Indian, he gets on the road and he drives back east. And he's crossing state lines with these Zaps. And selling them into head shops, and all this stuff is being sold non-returnable, and 60% off. 35 cents on the 2 comic 0 and 1, and 50 cents on the #2, non-returnable. And then they're coming into the head shops and stuff like this, and then again more district attorneys find it easy to pick on things. Like district attorneys are having to listen to church groups, so they were hassling about all the comic books back in the early 50s, so these comics started getting hassled also. and crossing state lines, and especially with Zap number 4 in 1969. That's when it got really crazy.
Right.
Because of this satire story Crumb had done called Joe Blow. The family that lays together stays together was the last panel.
I remember that.
That case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court established something back then called local community standards will prevail, which meant that every city in America, every county, every state, all those different jurisdictions could make up whatever they wanted to as that was their local community standards.
Interesting.
Which resulted in like 80 busts for underground comics all over the country all at once. So print mint was being consumed, helping out all these head shops being busted, plus crossing state lines made Bob Rita the target of all these things. So all these profits, quote unquote, that these underground, these comics creators were having trouble getting paid was all going into, these guys were making all this stuff, and somebody was out there selling it and crossing state lines and getting arrested for it.
Right.
So people want to, some of these creators, Bob Rita wouldn't pay me. Well, you guys, you wrote stuff that, I'm not quite sure what kind of words I should use for, sexual content and drug usage and stuff like this.
Right.
He's crossing state lines and going to jail and stuff like this, and you're complaining about not getting paid. Well, you can edit this out, but my attitude is on some of those guys, going to go themselves, basically. Because they're not looking at the big picture. So all the publishers that, by this point, Rip-Off Press has started up. Last Gasp has started up. Gary Arlington was a San Francisco comic book company. Another one called Company and Sons had cranked up, publishing Bon Bode Cheech Wizard and things like this.
Right.
And among other really cool books. And so there was, half a dozen, pushing a dozen comic book publishers in the Bay Area. Okay. All of this energy is going forward and stuff like this. In the meantime, in 1972, coming back full circle, Bud was bringing all these undergrounds. Like in 1970, he brought them to Multicon in Oklahoma City, in 71 to Dallas. He's leaving all the underground comics. He had to go up to his hotel room to buy them.
I see.
And he kept them in a locked chest.
Okay.
Scared shitless about being busted and stuff like this.
Right.
So we're going through doing this thing. I'm up in San Jose. John Barrett wants to buy in to Bud's mail order business. In the meantime, at the 1972 Multicon in Oklahoma City, I had missed out on breakfast Saturday morning. And they were just in the dealer's room all day long because it's like the comics, the stuff, the energy was just flowing.
Yes.
And you lived off of adrenaline back then when you're 19, 20 years old. So Sunday morning, 6:30, I get up earlier in the morning and the previous day I bought several dozen spirit sections, tabloid sections from Dave Gibson, who had cut a deal later on he cut a deal with Bill Gaines to reprint the EC membership fan club stuff. He cut a deal with Eisner to do spirit section packets, 10 of them, little black and white in bags. He came up with great ideas and didn't know how to market it at all. Anyways, I'm touring across the Biltmore Hotel in Oklahoma City at 6:30 in the morning to get into the restaurant before anybody gets in there, and I go home. That's Will Eisner sitting by himself over there. He's on New York time, so he's already awake.
Right.
Big overstuffed chair, and I saunter over there. I still never did get to the restaurant that day either, in the morning. And we spent 15 minutes or so talking about these old spirit tabloids. I was learning how come these are so much harder to find, because he said only about half a dozen newspapers carried the big tabloid. They had several hundred for the weekly, the smaller size one, as an insert, which also Steve Ditko's big thing. Pat Ditko, his little brother, tells a great story about Ditko trudging across town in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, starting in 1940. So he's born in 1940. He'd been like 13 years old. Yeah. And his father was a Hearst newspaper guy. So they got King Features section in there. And Ditko wanted that spirit section. He'd walk even in the wintertime, he'd walk all across town, spend a nickel or 10 cents whatever the newspaper was, throw the newspaper away and read the spirit section.
Yeah.
And many times, Ditko's mother take your brother Pat with you. So Pat his legs would wear out, so they'd walk across there on the way back, and Ditko's reading the thing. His baby brother Pat would get on a piggyback ride as Ditko's reading to his baby brother, reading the Eisner Spirit, and then the Lady Luck and the Mr. Mystic story. I mean, this is Pat's memory of his bigger brother Steve Ditko.
Right.
So anyways, Eisner and I started talking, our talk evolved into the concept of what's going to do. The big glut off the Batman TV show, it flooded things out. Comic book prices had just gone to 20 cents, moving towards a quarter at that time. He and I started talking, what can we do to save the American comic book? Because circulation, I mean, it was active talk. The industry was going under then, which has been being said for 100 years, by the way.
Right.
So he says, young guys like you should open up comic book stores as close to university college campuses as possible. All those high school students in the 60s, they're still reading. They want to read. So you got to go to where they're at. They're in colleges. So I bring this up with Bud and John 2 months later. That was in June. This is mid-August. So 10 days after the first El Cortez San Diego Comic-Con, we're up on Telegraph Avenue leasing this storefront for $500 a month. Phenomenal amount of money. I mean, these guys were paying like $40, $50 a month in San Jose for these little stores.
Right.
And other stores. But there was Collector's Bookstore in Hollywood. They'd taken over a Bank of America, and they had a time vault in the back there. They kept all the Superman 1s and stuff like this. Action 1s and Detective 27s and high-priced, very high-grade material in there. Huge store and stuff. That was the one we were emulating, trying to become, is Collector's Bookstore, which is mostly long forgotten now, which will be mentioned, but prominently, all this stuff's going into comic book store wars. This book I'm working on, 170 years of the comics history, of the business of comics, the technology changes. So we're opening up this store. John's making $125 a week. I'm making $100 a week. But I had originally, just helping them open this thing up, we'd gone back down to the Worldcon, did that, coming back up, came back. Bud and I moved into a house in 458 Harmony Lane in San Jose. John and I started traveling from San Jose up to Berkeley every day and working this store. And I was going to sit out the semester. I'm teaching John how to buy and sell old comic books, and I'm running all that part of stuff. I was seeing all kinds of potential being on Telegraph Avenue and all these students coming in. I mean, the concept of a comic book store was so alien then that the Berkeley police had put in plainclothes undercover cops. They were tapping our phones, convinced we had to be a major drug smuggling operation because all these people were coming in, carrying out small bags and stuff like this. So, so they were trying to figure out how we were doing, because, comic books being 20 cents, Telegraph Avenue back then was a high rent, high energy, wall-to-wall people from Bancroft all the way to Dwight Way. You couldn't even drive down the street. It was just all full of people back then. All these Vietnam vets coming back and PTSDs and all that stuff. So I go to Bud. What do you want to do? You want to just shut this down? It was just a bad experiment and stuff like this. So I take over the debt. I become a full partner in it. And then right around December, January or so, Nick Marcus and Mike Maniak have been trying to get a comic book convention going up, but they had no credibility with the associated students. They were trying to put it in the Poly Ballroom, where all these, in the late 60s, the Jefferson Airplane and Grateful Dead were playing there. There's concert posters for the Poly Ballroom shows, really beautiful ones. And initially, John Barrett's interfacing with the manager of the ASUC building there on the campus. Somewhere we got the money, so we had to pony up a couple $1,000s in advance to secure renting the place, because they didn't think we were going to bring enough people to pay admissions to pay for the show type of thing, so we had to pony the money up in advance. A guy named John Campbell, was running around to all the artists and stuff, getting the submissions for, all these underground cartoonists in the Bay Area. A guy named Clay Geardes comes through. All these people were coming. Francis Ford Coppola was a customer back then. Bruce Lee was a customer before Enter the Dragon. He lived in Oakland. He used to bring his son Brendan in. Right. All these people were coming in before that Berkeley Con in '73. Mm-hmm. We got the front cover and 4-page interior article in the pink section of the San. It's like, I'm trying to. Newer people won't even know the energy that the pink section of the Chronicle Examiner were co-publishing in Sunday paper together. And then we also got mentioned in Herb Caen. Herb Caen, back then, if you were mentioned in Herb Caen, you were somebody. I mean, that type of thing doesn't exist in newspapers anymore. Right. I'm trying to think of the analogy to use of being mentioned on somebody's blog on the internet. Got millions of people reading it. So anyways, we had like 4,000 people come through. The university campus students were $1. Kids under 12 were free. General admission was $3 for the weekend. On Sunday afternoon, in walks this 2 hours before the show ending. It's like Mick Marcus and Mike Maniak were like stoned all the time. They were pretty useless. We didn't trust them to do anything. And it was like I'd hired some customers and stuff like Scott Maple that later became our Sacramento manager. I hired him to run in our booth and stuff like this. The last 2 hours of the show, we were letting Mick Marcus and Mike Maniak run the admissions table. We figured we can't do any harm at this point. And in comes this Dr. Arnheim and his wife, and there's a building maintenance guy. And he's got a jack loader with a pallet on it, and it's covered in boxes of old comic books. He'd seen the stuff on TV, and he'd seen the pink section. And he starts talking, and Mick Marcus and Mike Maniak, they go through all the boxes. They pull out all the Marvel Timely issues out of there, pay the guy like $1 a piece. Mick Marcus runs to the entrance of the dealer's room and shouts out, "Hey, there's this big pallet of Golden Age comics, and they're real cheap." And they run out of the building. David Belmont, Bob Selvig, and I come around on it to see what the commotion was and stuff like this. And I'm looking through this stuff. I brought up with me the Overstreet price guide. And I says, hey, because I'm trying to beat off all the other potential competition. There were other dealers there, and everybody's starting to gather like piranha, like a cow falling in the Amazon River. Right. And so here's a price guide. It's like, I'll pay you an honest percentage of whatever this book says, all these comic books. And the guy asked me, how much is a Captain America #1? And I don't know why he's saying that. I think maybe it's in there. And I look it up. I said, it's like $80. And he gets this look on his face. He says, okay. And then he talks to the maintenance guy. We're leaving. He's still leaving. Turns out he got paid $1 by these other two guys.
I see.
So, learn the tale of this guy. Tom Riley had started buying comic books in 1939. Just buying them and stuff like that. But in December 1941, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy or the Armed Forces. But they did say, like a week or two after Pearl Harbor, parents lived in Piedmont, California. And they proceeded to start buying one of every comic book being published. Putting them in his room, stacking them up, not being touched, waiting for their son to come home. In summer of 1945, they get word that their son had been killed in a kamikaze attack. And that's all I knew of it and stuff like that. There were 3 different batches of relatives. So Selvig, Belmont, and then us at the Berkeley Comic Art Shop, we split it into thirds. Basically, we figured out, okay, these are the really cool ones, like Mystery Men #1, 1939 Fox, and some of these other ones. These are expensive ones. These are the ones we're going to fight over. All this other stuff, like Golden Age, Green Lantern #1 would have gone into a stack like that. But, Green Lantern like 2 or 3 up, these are all like, cheap books. it took us hours until about 4 in the morning just to figure out the relative. Here's the $10 stack, the $20 stack, the $50 stack. It was like 1,500 books altogether. You know, CGC and these supposed experts, they want to say this collection was really small. They're completely wrong. And then once I'm piecing together what was in what we got out of that first batch, and then the second batch of relatives, I'm going to Bud and John. There's more books. We never made a list up of this stuff, but we went. So we got these books. Got the first batch in April, the second batch in May. In May, we opened up our second store in San Francisco. Then the third batch comes in. Within 2 months, we had another store in San Jose and another store in Sacramento. We went from 1 store to 4 stores in 3 months.
Now, we have a few minutes left, but
Sure.
I want to wind into, tell us about, briefly if you can, because it's a loaded question, Rick Griffin, Jerry Garcia, how comic shops interacted with the countercultural youth in the Bay Area in the 1970s. You know, you briefly mentioned it to some degree with the undergrounds and stuff, but tell us about Rick Griffin, Jerry Garcia.
Well, Rick Griffin, first time I met Rick Griffin, I kicked him out of my store. Didn't know who he was. I mean, there was this lady that called up, had some weird tail pulps for sale from a church bazaar, Sunday morning. She comes in and I go, what do you want for these? It was like several hundred of them. Complete run from 1924, small size, up through 1939. And she says, is $1 a piece okay? And these were like mint. I mean, they even had the pulp overlap flaps. I mean, the paper wasn't even torn up. And this big 6'2", 6'3" guy in a long blonde hair and a t-shirt and rope for a belt and sandals and jeans, and he comes running up. Well, I got $16, and he starts pouring through the book. I said, well, who the hell are you? This is my store. You don't pay rent here. Well, I'm Rick Griffin. I said, get the fuck out of here. Yeah. Coming on top of this, you know, because he looked like just any other straight person off the street, basically. He'd come up. Tales from the Tube had been published originally as a surfer magazine insert. Printment had added more pages, just like the Plymouth edition and Zap had done more pages. He'd come up to pick the artwork up. So he's coming in and stuff like this. That's how I met Rick and stuff like this. But I go, if you really are Rick Griffin, you come back tomorrow with some Rick Griffin art and I will trade you really favorably. In the meantime, like I said, you know, get the F out of here, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I went home that night and said, God, some asshole came in the store claiming to be Rick Griffin. You know, because he was like this mythical god to some of us. Still is on some levels. But anyways, the next morning, Monday morning, he's waiting out there as I'm pulling out. Oh, shit, I kicked Rick Griffin out of the store. And he apologized, I apologized, and stuff like this. He pulls out artwork, and pulls out some of the Weird Tales, and he's going after some Frazetta comics. I remember he also got a Harold Gray comic book, Little Joe 4-color #1. He really wanted that. It was like, I don't know, $25, $30. But when I ended up with him, it's $150 at what he wanted for. I didn't quibble at all. I ended up with the Tales from the Tube cover for $150. It's like, yes. And we became friends after that, and we'd see each other over the years and stuff like this. Guys like Jerry Garcia were coming in. I mean, Joey Ramone was coming in. I mean, I remember Kirk Hammett, Metallica, his mother was driving him in from Antioch or out that neck of the woods, starting like he was 11 years old. I mean, all these people, I mean, I know Leonardo DiCaprio since he was 12. Robin Williams was coming in before Morgan Mindy into my Haight-Ashbury store. Jerry Garcia was buying comics. Whenever he'd have a free moment, he'd be coming through. Francis Ford Coppola was a customer. I remember when Francis Ford Coppola brought in a couple film students named Steve and George before that truck driver movie came out and before THX
1138.
There we go. I always mess that up. I don't know why. And then well before American Graffiti even. And these were, when Star Wars came out, I was looking at some of them machines out there. I recognized a couple of them things. Well, those are off of Black Hawk covers that I sold George Lucas. You know, years later.
Cool. Yeah.
Years later, you know, it seems like Bruce Lee was a customer. I just knew him as Cato out of Green Hornet. He was bringing in his son Brendan. When Von Baudet moved out, he was bringing in his son Mark as like a 9-year-old and stuff. I mean, all these people. Telegraph Avenue was afloat. Haight-Ashbury was afloat. That Columbus Street would get a lot of traffic. People coming out of the from the Upper Grant area where Carol Doda had her Condor Club. That neck of the woods up there, Chinatown. And the tourists would come down Columbus Avenue on the way down towards Golden Gate, down towards the Fisherman's Wharf. And that was so things. By 1978, I opened up a Pier 39 store. It was one of the first 4 stores opened out there. Really high rent area there. And the whole mentality was bringing the comics to people that didn't normally collect comics and creating new collectors out of. They didn't know they wanted it until they saw it.
Interesting.
You know, and I remember when Garfield went hot and stuff like this. Jim Davies came through and he was swapping me Garfield dailies, 3 for $100 for old 1920s and 30s comic strip Sunday pages. Jerry Garcia. All this stuff is mythical. And anyways, we'll pick it up.
Yeah, well, thank you, Bob.